Okay, well, let me introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Very recently back from Jordan, about a month, I guess. A little over a month. Okay. So Dr. Stephen Collins is a world-famous archaeologist. We are extremely blessed to have him join us this evening. We had a wonderful time at lunch listening to some of his tales and some of the almost science when it comes to, no giggles in the back, as it comes to the dig and what they have found, and he's going to go into quite a lot of detail regarding that. I want to just briefly introduce him because as he goes through his talk, he's going to tell you more about himself when it's relevant. So I'm looking forward to that as well. So like I said, he's among the world's famous archaeologists. He is director of the School of Archaeology at Veritas International University and serves as consulting research professor in the College of Archaeology, Trinity Southwest University. He is director and chief archaeologist of Tal El Hammam excavations in Jordan, now completing its 16th session? 16 seasons of digging in the Jordan. Prior to Tal El Hammam, which I'm probably really not saying correctly, Dr. Collins excavated at other sites in Israel and Palestine. Please join me this evening in welcoming Dr. Stephen Collins.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here. They say the sun will, somebody told me the sun will hit the mountain about 7:30. If this were a normal talk of mine, we'd be sailing several hours past this, so we'd be in the shade eventually. An hour talk terrifies me. This is an introduction to an introduction. For most of my, at VIU where I lecture, the shortest lecture I ever do is 3 hours. And usually it's 6 hours, 3 hours before lunch, and then 3 hours afterwards. And because we have students all over the world, and we live stream, but also sometimes they like to come in. So if you stream classes out over weeks, it's very expensive for them. So they can fly in, do an intensive, fly out. And so I'm used to talking a lot. And so, but tonight I have two presentations. One that I will not show you, this one I will. So why in the world would I tell you about the other one? Because I know, I can see it in your eyes, that there are some of you who are going to ask questions to which I will quickly jump to the other PowerPoint to show you pictures of what I'm talking about in answer to your questions. So essentially, there are two sides to this. One is just simply the issue of Sodom. People say, and it is true, we have gotten, our group, our excavation team has gotten more press, probably 100 times more press than any other archaeological site in the Near East over the last 20 years. That's easy to compute. Because some of my colleagues working at sites like Gezer, Lachish, Hazor, and really? And those are great sites. And these are great guys, great archaeologists. They're the best of the best. But who ever heard of those places? But when you claim that you've discovered biblical Sodom, which is sort of a household name, at least up to the last generation. And I always said about the current generation that they better hurry up and invent, really master artificial intelligence because they're going to need it. More than any other generation, they need a little help. When you mention, in fact, I mentioned on a plane to somebody, I'm actually just a millennial, because this was like 7, 8, 10 years ago, and we're talking about being an archaeologist, we're talking about what he did and what I did, and where are you excavating? Tal El Hammam in Jordan, it's a site we think is biblical Sodom. Silence. What's that? Can you imagine? No, you can't imagine, because in our day, it's like a household word. I mean, Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, it's Las Vegas. I mean, We always made all those connections. So it was something we understood, but now it's not. But it does kick up controversy. I guarantee if we had never said that Tal al-Hammam was Sodom, because, and I'm going to show you why in a moment, that's what this PowerPoint is all about. If we had never said that, this would be known, everybody would be with us. It is archaeologically, it is the most important Bronze Age type site because it has all the stratigraphy from the Chalcolithic period all the way down through, probably Neolithic as well, but Chalcolithic at least down through the end of the Middle Bronze Age. And everything in between, it's continuously occupied. In fact, we now know it as the largest continuously occupied Bronze Age site in the entire southern Levant. And so it's an important site. Our ceramics tie everybody else's together because we have all the transition forms and the evolution of all the ceramic types across that region. We have them, we can see them at our site. Nobody else can, and not to that extent. So it's a very, very important site. But boy, I tell you what, the day we mentioned that this could be biblical Sodom, people came out of the woodwork. Our colleagues did. I mean, I have colleagues that I work with that still don't buy it. Still don't buy it. But I promise you they've never been there. Not a single person who criticizes us as far as that geographical location has ever been to the site. Every scholar who has bothered, and I have always had a standing invitation, any scholar who wants to come and hang out with us at Tal al-Hammam, I won't pay for your airfare. You get here, I'll put you up in a hotel room for as long as you want to stay, and you'll come out to the site and you'll hang with us, and I will show you why I think what I think. Every scholar who's ever done that, and have been quite a few, they went up to the top of the site. In fact, I'll just give you the story of my own, of Lane Rittmeyer, who's the top archaeological architect in that region and does the work, reconstruction drawings and top drawings and plans for most excavations. And he was not convinced. And when he came up to the top of the site one day, I said, okay, Lane, here it is. And we go up to, we call it the talk from the top. And I go up to the top of the site. You can see everything 360 around the southern Jordan Valley. You can see the Dead Sea, Mount Nebo behind you. You can see the Jordan River. You can see Jericho over here. You can see the buildings on the Mount of Olives over here very clearly. And so I give him the talk from the top. How Abraham came into the land and pitched his tent by Bethel and Ai and went down and came back. And I go through all of that geography, and you can see it all. That's the neat thing about it. You can see it all right there. And the first thing he said after I got through, and every other person has said exactly the same phrase. Wow. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? Everybody, Herschel Shanks of Bar, when he was at the site, said that. And so it was pretty obvious. Yes, it's pretty obvious. And I'll tell you why it's so obvious. Because we just weren't kicking around in the dirt and go, oh, there's something here. No. I did 5 years of intensive textual research from the ground up and on-ground exploration into this subject before we ever put a spade in the ground, before we ever started the excavation. It was the geography, the internal geography of the biblical text itself that took us to this location. We followed the text to this location, working the knowns to the unknowns. That's where it took us. I had no idea it was even there. We had no idea anything was there. But yet there it was, and nobody had ever excavated it. A couple of other sites around had been excavated. This one had never been excavated. It was a monster. I'd been to all the other sites. I'd been working archaeology in the region for decades before then. I knew all the sites. I'd been to all the sites. When I first walked up to this site and just stood there looking at it, and I was only looking at the upper tell, we realized about 2 or 3 seasons in that the lower city was far larger than even the upper city. But it was so large, it just looked like the natural landscape below it. In fact, that whole platform of landscape was actually the city 100 feet above the surrounding plain. And when we finally noticed that, it was that, okay, this is not just big, it's a monster. And so Well, that's all in the PowerPoint, only more technically. So I want to take you through this, but you would not believe the criticism that's been thrown at us. You won't believe the criticism. In fact, I probably shouldn't say his name. Probably one of the most popular archaeologists working in Georgia, from George Washington University, working in Israel at Megiddo, Tel Kabri, friend of mine. He told me one day, we were sitting down at happy hour at ASOR one year, and this was, I think, in the second year, but this was my first presentation at ASOR on Tal Hamam. And he looked at me and he said, Steve, you know what you really need? He knew the criticism that was cropping up all around me. And he said, what you really need is an inscription. You need an inscription that tells you that's Sodom. Now, I know the score on this. Come on. There isn't a single archaeological site in the southern Levant that's been identified via an inscription. But I guarantee dozens or hundreds of them have been biblically identified, but not via an inscription, except for Ekron. Ekron, was kind of a spoiler, right? They run into a little stela, a little stone. It says, the king of Ekron welcomes you to his precincts. Okay. But there hasn't been another one. And so no site is identified. So this person is working at Megiddo. And I looked at him and I said, okay, that's fair. What in situ, in period, inscriptional evidence do you have at Megiddo showing that that's Megiddo? Deer in the headlights. You see? I said, then don't require of me what you require of yourself, or don't require of yourself and no one else. And he got it. He got it big time, because the next day, first, and I tell you this story because you can't imagine the pushback from the traditional archaeological community. So, next day is my presentation. And the room is crammed. Normally for these things, you have there's like 30 presentations going on at once, right? And you have a few here, a few there. Well, this thing was packed with people standing around the wall. And I'm going, oh man, I'm feeling like hemmed in, right? I'm going to get pot-shotted right here. And so I gave my presentation. 25-minute presentation. That was back a long time ago. Now they're like cranked it down to 15 or something. But I spent 20 minutes just going over the archaeology. And I spent the last 5 minutes of that presentation asking the question, could Tal Hamam be biblical Sodom? That's it. Just a question. And I ran through a little bit of what I'm going to show you. And then if you've ever been to these professional society meetings, and ASOR is the big one, for all the Near East archaeologists, you know that at the end of a presentation, you have like a minute and a half for questions, right? And most of the time, nobody even raises their hand. It's like, okay, that's good. Let's get on to the next one. So I say, thankfully, it was before lunch. Last one before lunch. So I said, are there any questions? Half the hands in the room went up. And I'm going, kind of shocked me, and I'm thinking, I got time for to answer one question. And so I'm just scanning the room with my eyes, and I see the fellow I had been with the night before sitting right in the front row. And I said, I shouldn't say his name, but I pointed to him and I said his name. And he said this to me, which sounded really snarky, but it wasn't, because I knew that instead of throwing me a fast pitch, he was doing this to me. Just hit this. And here's what he said, because he sort of wrapped up all the sentiment in the room in this question. Here's what he said. He said, Dr. Collins, do you make this Sodom identification primarily for fundraising purposes? Now, had we not had that conversation the evening before, I don't know what I would have done, actually. I probably would have said the same thing, but not with the same calmness, right? But I knew where this was coming. Here's what I said. I said, that's a great question. Let me put it like this. It was the biblical text who led us to the site. Thus far, the archaeology and the geography of the area is commensurate with, if not identical with, the biblical text. And therefore, we have made the preliminary identification of this as biblical Sodom. And I really, really do hope this helps in the fundraising. And I got a standing ovation. Everybody just went, whew. The tension was off, and it was like, okay. All right, it was okay. It was all right. But there has been pushback. And I don't know why. Did they push back when they identified Gezer, or Lachish, or Ashkelon, or Jerusalem? Do you know there's no inscriptional evidence for the city of David? How do you even know it's there? All of these are geographical exercises, pure and simple. The awful. We know where David's city was located because there are descriptions in the text of valleys and hills and mountains and rivers and other cities that can be triangulated from, and you can reach a conclusion based on the location of point A because of something about point B and point C and so on. That's what we did in Sodom. It was the biblical text that took us there. And by the way, how many biblical sites are identified on Bible maps that have 1, 2, 3 geographical indicators in the text? Probably 35. Let me give you the top 2. The top 2 biblically recognized on maps sites are Jerusalem. Well, number 2 is Jerusalem. How many do you think? How many separate geographical indicators are there in the text? And by the way, you also have to put the chronological indicators in there as well. Because, if you think a site is a particular site from the Iron Age and there's nothing there but Hellenistic, it can't be that site. Right? It has to be time and place. It has to be both of those. So, Jerusalem has how many? 18. In the Old Testament, there are 18 geographical indicators for the location of David's Jerusalem. Guess how many there are for Sodom? There are 25 indicators. Sodom comes in at number 1 by a long shot. 25 indicators in the text, geographically and chronologically, as to the location of Sodom, to the identification of Sodom. And so what I tell people is this. People say, oh, you discovered biblical Sodom. No, I didn't, any more than I could claim to have discovered Los Alamos if someone had given me today a New Mexico map, and I looked at it, and I just looked, and I found the road, and I drove, and I came to it, and whoa, there is a Los Alamos. I saw the sign, and there it is. I could not be the discoverer of Los Alamos anymore with that good map, any more than I could be attributed with the discovery of Sodom using that good map. It's a good map. By the way, except one, virtually every 19th century explorer scholar who worked in the region, either for the government or for missionary purposes or why ever they were there, guess what? When they wrote these massive volumes of geography, because they're riding around on their horses with their Bibles slung over their saddle horn, looking for biblical places, following the biblical text, how many of them put Sodom at the south end of the Dead Sea where the traditional location is? None of them. They all put it north of the Dead Sea. North of the Dead Sea. North and east of the Dead Sea, which is exactly what the Bible says it is. We're going to see that. All right, you ready for this? Here we go. It's 161 slides. You ready? That's the abstract. You have it on your table. I'm not going to go through it. And this is going to be a little bit pedantic. I apologize. I cranked up this presentation from my International Symposium on Archaeology and the Bible presentation from a couple of years ago, and because it's more technical, okay? And so I figured you guys can handle it, right? Walter Rast on Sodom. Now, Rast was the excavator of one of the traditional southern side of Sodom, Baba Dra. He says, in addition to its cultural and historical importance, Baba Dra figures into discussions regarding the location of biblical Sodom. I'm going to read fast because there's a lot of these. Of Sodom and Gomorrah. The question is whether Baba Dra, specifically the EB3 city, can be related in any way to the biblical city of Sodom, which biblical traditions place in the general region of this area. Really? But anyway, that's what Rast said. By the way, even though I get pot-shotted all the time for trying to identify Sodom, nobody ever raised a voice of objection to Walter Rast for talking about Baba Dra as Sodom. Strange. But anyway, that's the way it goes in this game. So, he says, although certain scholars earlier this century argued to locate Sodom and its related cities at the north end of the Dead Sea, recent scholarship has generally placed the cities at the south end of the Dead Sea Valley. While both Albright and Lapp concluded that Baba Drah was indirectly connected with ancient Sodom as a cult center, perhaps for the cities of the plain, they also assumed that Sodom and the related cities in the biblical accounts lay buried below the waters of the south end of the Dead Sea. That's an etiological legend. The legends were invented by the scholars. The legends about the location of Sodom were invented by the scholars because they have nothing to do with what the biblical text says. They looked at the south end of the Dead Sea and they go, oh, that looks like a place God would have destroyed. I promise you, that's as high as their scholarship gets. It's bizarre to me, but anyway, this is the kind of thing we have to deal with. Here's some more. The recent account, in the Genesis account show that Sodom was located, that the location of Sodom was generally perceived by the Israelites as lying somewhere in the Dead Sea region. Okay, two possibilities exist. One is that Sodom was a fictional place name to begin with, and that a city by this name never existed, but came into being as an element of a local story or a tale, stressing. And this is an important part of this. A destruction severe enough to account for the startling physiography of the Dead Sea region. See, that's fancy language for not doing any study at all, other than just superficial, oh, it looks ugly. God must have destroyed this. See, how do they get away with this? I have no idea. But anyway, Walter Rass is going to go on. A second and different approach to the problem, he says, however, assumes that an ancient city did exist in the Dead Sea region during antiquity and that its name was remembered, but the location of its ruins was forgotten. If the second of these approaches is followed, the evidence from Baba Drah and Numera becomes as important as the only ancient sites in the Dead Sea. I love this statement. The only ancient sites in the Dead Sea region which remain can possibly be tallied with the biblical accounts. We're going to show you some more in that. The theory of buried cities beneath the sea seems more tenuous given our new understanding of ancient settlement patterns in the region. That is absolute. Everything in that whole paragraph right there is nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. You're going to see it, and you could go back and read this and go, that's nonsense. Okay? Martin Mulder. Usually it's thought that these cities were situated on the south coast of the Dead Sea, but there is no agreement in the biblical record concerning their exact position. Thank you. Because the topography in the Hebrew Bible is extremely vague, which is also not true, if you're going to do biblical archaeology, I suggest read the text. It was possible to look for the Pentapolis also on the north end of the Dead Sea, in the vicinity of the outlet of the Jordan River into that sea. At least he got that far. Thank you very much for that little piece of insight. One might find support for this supposition in Genesis 13:10-12, where mention is made of the plain of the Jordan, and there's a whole bunch more. On the other hand, however, the bitumen pits in the valley of Sodom have been localized in the shallow south part of the Dead Sea. That's also nonsense. You know where most of the bitumen pits are? They're still there today. And by the way, we know that Tal el-Hammam is a bitumen mining center. It's on the north end of the Dead Sea. Well, anyway. And that has to do with the story of Kedorlaomer, and that's a whole other PowerPoint. That's a whole other issue. But let's continue with Mulder. It's highly uncertain, if not improbable, that the vanished cities of the Pentapolis will ever be recovered. Oh, give up. Just give up so easily. Still, on the whole, it is by no means impossible that a big catastrophe in prehistoric times. If they don't even know where the city is and they can't even do any tests on it to see if there was any kind of catastrophe at all, earthquake, whatever, what is this all about? How can you even say that? It's by no means impossible that a big catastrophe in prehistoric times did live on in the memory of the peoples living around the Dead Sea, and that later on, the essential features of that tradition were taken over by the Israelites. Well, there's a little bit of sanity in that whole discussion right there. Now, back to me. Given that neither Rast nor Mulder, or Albright or Lapp or any other Southern Sodom proponent for that matter, provided an adequate analysis of the relevant geographical text for the cities of the plain. Isn't that interesting? They talk about it, but they never provide an analysis of the biblical text, word by word, phrase by phrase, and connect it to all the Semitic cognates if necessary. Now, on what did they rely in arriving at their conclusions about Sodom's location? What was this all about? They relied on their presuppositions. That's what they did regarding the origin and composition of the Sodom narratives, which, in the extant conventional wisdom, assumed that the stories must be either etiological or kernels of historical memory. This is the standard documentary hypothesis. Don't get me started. I teach a class on that, and that's another piece of late 19th century nonsense. Essentially, they pondered their own assumptions, their own belly buttons, and the assumptions of others while virtually avoiding the relevant text and the proper scientific and historiographical analyses that could reasonably ascertain either the veracity or fictionality of the narrative components. In other words, if you're going to do archaeology and going to mention the Bible, then probably you ought to include the text in your mind in your discussion. They also assumed that the conventional wisdom of archaeology about the Dead Sea region statements was correct. But it wasn't correct, and I want to show you that it wasn't correct, and it still isn't correct. They operated with erroneous assumptions about the Dead Sea region settlements that still influence today's most used maps, perpetuating the same critical errors and omissions, as you will see. Now, I want to show you something interesting. This is an early Bronze Age. Now, I had a very good friend. He passed away a number of years ago, Anson Rainey. Good atheist friend of mine. And Anson and I had a very close relationship because we both think geographically. He's considered the premier historical geographer of the region. It is only his atlas of the region, historical atlas, the Sacred Bridge, that's usable, say, in a doctoral dissertation or a master's thesis. Nothing else can be used. His is the definitive one. Here's Sacred Bridge, 2015. I want you to notice something. I want you to notice that little piece of real estate right there. What's on that piece of real estate? Jericho on the other side of the river. What's on the east side of the river? Nothing. Nothing. This is what archaeology thinks it knows about that region. Nothing. It's a blank. There it is. Nothing on Anson Rainey's map. By the way, we had lots of discussions before he died, and he was going to fix it. He died before he could. Here's the intermediate Bronze Age site map. And that takes us from about 2500 down to about 2100 BC. Look at this. Except for a little place named Iktanu, which we now know is one of our many satellites, it's blank. It's a blank. Now let's go to the really important period. The Middle Bronze Age site map of the region. Look at this. It's blank. How is it blank? It's blank. That's what it should look like. This is the Bronze Age archaeological map in the land of the Kikar, identifiable today as a result of the Tal Hammam excavation project. That's what it looks like. It's the most intensely populated area in the entire, what we might call the Holy Land. It has more cities, towns, villages, and I haven't included the villages and hamlets. These are just cities that are recognizable from fortifications. Here they are. In fact, when we got over there, we had a blank slate because nobody showed anything on that side of the river. The Bible tells us it ought to be right there where Tal Hammam is located here. It ought to be right there, far enough from the river not to get inundated with a 100 or 1,000 year flood. You've got to stay away from the river. That's why Jericho's where it is, away from the river. And so we said, it has to be in this area. And, well, it was. How did we get there? When you realize that six fortified babadras could fit inside Tal Hammam's fortified perimeter with room to spare, the omission of critical archaeological data from the Sodom discussion looms minimally as unfortunate and perhaps egregious. Baba Draw, which everybody still, not everybody, so many people are shifting over to our site, but so many people still hold to Baba Draw. Baba Draw is a marginal early Bronze Age town that went out of business in 2500 BC. At least 5 centuries before the earliest possible date for the birth of Abraham. But yet, people will still make points. So what gets us from that to that? Well, let me show you how we got from that to that. It's pretty simple, actually. And this is a little goad with which we kind of irritate our colleagues. If in the past, archaeologists and Bible scholars had taken the Sodom tales seriously and paid closer attention to the abundant geographical details embedded in the relevant biblical text, they would have discovered the marvelous civilization in the biblical land of the Kikar. That's what it's called in Genesis 19. Haaretz HaKikar. Like the land of Israel, land of the Philistines, land of the Moabites, land of Egypt. That's an ethno-linguistic tag. The Kikar, which is translated plain, we're going to see that, is often just ignored, but you can't ignore it, because it's called, with an ethno-linguistic tag, the land of the Kikar. It's its own identifiable culture. If they had bothered to look at the Bible, they would have discovered this a long time ago, but they didn't, and they didn't. They didn't pay attention to the text, and they didn't find anything because they didn't go looking, but we did, and we did. We paid attention to the text, and when we went on the ground looking, we found everything on the ground that the Bible describes for that area. Oh, go figure. So, testing the reality of a biblical civilization's existence, even narrative elements associated with it, isn't rocket science. I mean, some of you kind of fit into that category, right? You're rocket science, physicists, all right? But it does require that such investigations proceed in accordance with proper historiographical and geographical methodologies, which do have the scientific method at their base if they're done properly. Okay. So, overburdens of literary origin theories and conventional wisdom regarding the historical versus fictional nature of extant ancient textual materials must be laid aside in favor of an objective treatment of the synthetic or testable elements of, in this case, the Sodom narratives. That's what you have to do. And so let's do that. And that's the key. Assume nothing. And I won't go into it, but you'll remember a cute little episode in The Odd Couple. Do you remember that? When they went to court on a traffic ticket. And anyway, he was telling the judge that not to assume anything. And he circles ass and you and me. Because if you assume, you make an ass of you and me. Do you remember that? That was a great little episode. But anyway. So we have to analyze the testable components of a given narrative, not the assumptions or hypotheses. You can't assume anything about that narrative. You have to go say, what does the text say? What does it not say? Only go with what it says, and don't meander into what it does not say. You have to take it at face value, but you also have to do a rigorous examination of all the lexicography, the phenomenology, the grammar, syntax, everything. And you have to do that. If you don't, you're in trouble. What's the scientific means of locating an ancient city? Here it is. Analyze all the ancient texts. And I'm not going to do these wholly, just going to go through them quickly. Analyze the geographical language for specificity. Assess the known and unknown geographical quanta from extracted textual geodata. Assemble a theoretical map. And that's your theory, right? That's your geographical theory. You have a theory. What's a good theory? A theory is one that can be either proved or disproved. You can set out the criteria whereby a theory can be proved or disproved. If you can't do that, of course, the analytical philosophers say just sit down and shut up. But the theory here is testable, right? We say, according to our theory of the text, it should be located in this area. Let's go look. There's your observation. So the scientific means of locating an ancient city continues. Analyze the chronological parameters. I mentioned that already. It has to be in the right time frame. Analyze the relevant physical data from everything. Paleoclimatology has become a big deal in our analysis of the biblical text. Why? Because it says in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all during that period, it says, and there was great famine in the land. Well, if you don't take that into account, you don't do the climatology, you're going to get hit from out of the left field, and you're not going to be prepared. Well, we did that. Assess the points of correspondence and departure from the theoretical text map and the physical data from proposed locations. You might need to make some adjustments in your hypothesis, and so on, and you are familiar with that. I am not going to read this paragraph because I don't want to waste your time on it. It's just basically saying if we can trust for example, the battle accounts of Tutmosis III as being geographically accurate, then the biblical accounts should be taken as well. Because I mentioned this to some scholars at a convocation once. I said ancient geographies never invented fictitious geography. Ancient writers never invented fictitious geography. And somebody raised their hand. She was head of ACOR at the time, and she said, Dr. Collins, you probably shouldn't say never. As a scientist, you shouldn't say never. I said, point well taken. Point well taken. I turned around from her and from the speaker's podium to go to the chalkboard. Then I turned back and I said, "Oh, and can you give me an example? Can you give me an example of a fictitious geography?" No, she couldn't. And I said, well, if you ever find, I'm really interested in this subject, and if you ever find one, I would really appreciate you sending that to me, and also give me the criteria whereby you determine it's fictitious. Never heard from her. That was like 18 years ago. So, what does the biblical text actually say about the location of Sodom and the cities of the plain? What does it actually say? I know what people think. I know what so many of my colleagues say and think. But what does the text actually say? After all, Sodom is only mentioned, well, actually not. We just found it in the Egyptian text. That's exciting. I won't mention that tonight because I don't want to get on that rabbit trail. But we actually found it. What does it actually say about Sodom and the cities of the plain? And Genesis 18, I'm not going to go into that because it's going to tell us where it is. That's the one that's going to go up the valley. Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim unto Lasha. That's going to give us the Canaanites of the valley in Genesis 10. We have to remember in doing this that the stories comprising the text of Genesis are what we call serial geographies. They take the reader from place to place. By the way, did you realize that nothing in the Old Testament, no person or event is introduced in the Old Testament without first place is established? Did you realize that? It's a marvelous geography. And they are very textually, or they are geographically oriented in all of their texts. Now, by the way, this is just a little funny, but it makes the point. A little fact overlooked by many scholars. They didn't invent fictitious geographies. Let me show you what I did with this. Whether or not the characters and events recorded by the Genesis writers are fact or fiction, the stories are layered over a real-world geography. That's the point. I mean, whether you want to take the stories literally, the characters literally, the stories are laid over a real-world geography with which those writers were intimately familiar. That's an important point. And so whether the Genesis stories were written during the Bronze Age, which would be the maximalist view, or the Iron Age, the minimalist view, the characters traverse known terrain, either with actual cities, towns, and villages. So they are either living maybe eyewitness descriptions of actual Bronze Age cities, if that is the case, or if they're Iron Age stories, then they're at least correct geography, but maybe etiological legends, right? They're trying to explain why this pile of ruins is there. And so many scholars do that. Now, there's no matter how you slice it, the biblical geography is fact-based. It is not a mythical construct, including Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain. And I'm going to go through this because I already bumped that. That's those geography data points. And that's Genesis 10. But I want to jump to the key point. By the way, that's the geography. That's the way it looks. You have the valley cities, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, up to Lasha, and Sidon, Gaza, and Gerar on the coast. And Joshua actually says the Canaanites are living along the coast and in the Jordan Valley. And there they are, along the coast and in the Jordan Valley. And so it's very clear. Now, where have scholars put them over the last 150 years? Now look at this. By the way, this map is from an 1880s Bible. Right? Look where they put the cities of the plain. It's interesting. How did they get there? How did they arrive at that location? They followed the geography of Genesis. How did the 20th century scholars arrive at the southern end of the Dead Sea? How did they put it down there? Here's what I say. They completely ignored the geography of Genesis. In other words, they may have turned the biblical map just upside down. They just flipped it. And it was just about as scientific as that. The culprit here, of course, is none other than W.F. Albright. He's the one that put it in the south end of the Dead Sea, under the water. He put it under the water. How scientific is that? Guess what? The water dried up since Albright's time. Dried up. There's no water in the southern basin of the Dead Sea anymore. Archaeologists went down there snorting around. Guess what? Not one sherd of pottery. It's a stupid place to build a city or a town or a village in a sump where every time it rains, the area fills up. It's a bizarre thing anyway. Bless his heart. I'll just, again, Albright goes back to this etiological thing. Oh, it looks like a place God would have destroyed. Now, let's be fair. W.F. Albright was a genius. But sometimes he didn't read the text. Well, why Genesis 13? That's the key. We're going to go to Genesis 13. Let's slog through it. I'm going to quote it here. And the reason I'm going to go through the whole thing, I'm going to take out all the non-geographical incidentals. Right? I'm just going to quote the geography part of it. And but why Genesis 13? I'll tell you why. Because it's the only passage in the Bible specifically written to take you to Sodom. It's a verbal map. It's specifically written to take you to Sodom so that if you know the geography, you can follow along. And therefore, it is the only primary text for the location of Sodom in the whole Bible. The topography in the Hebrew Bible is extremely vague. Do you remember that statement? Nonsense. I want to show you. Here it is. Let's read it. So, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, and Lot went with him. From the Negev, he went there's that serial geography, place to place, until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai. Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of Yahweh, like the land of Egypt, toward Zoar. I think it's Zoan, but that's another story. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Actually, it's just Ad Sodom. He pitched his tents as far as Sodom. So there it is. Now, in this passage, the word plain appears 3 times. That's really interesting. I hate Bible translators. We have a rabbi. I hate Bible translators. Because they just muff the Hebrew terribly sometimes. The word plain, what is this? In Hebrew, there are 4 main words for plain or low place or bottomland, valley bottom, Bika, Emek, Mishor, Arava. But the word translated plain or valley in Genesis 13 is not one of the stock words in Hebrew for valley or anything related to a valley. But it's always translated plain or valley. It doesn't mean plain or valley, never did. But yet that's how they translate it. Well, it's bizarre. Well, here it is. What does it mean? What is it? It's the word kikar. It's the word kikar. If you go to Jerusalem today and drive around you like roundabouts? Do you have roundabouts here? Some people hate roundabouts. They don't know how to use them. You know, they're terrified when they come upon a roundabout. They don't understand it. And in Jerusalem, if you go to a roundabout and you look for a sign and you see a sign that names the roundabout, it's going to be called, that roundabout's going to be called Kikar. Why? Because that's what it means. Kikar is the ancient word for roundabout. It means circle, disc, round. Okay? That's what it means. Kikar in the Old Testament refers over 50 times. It's used 68 times in the Old Testament. Over 50 times it refers to either a talent of metal, a talent. You remember talents? Okay. It's a flat circular ingot of metal, or it refers to flat bread. I like talking to New Mexicans because they get that, right? Circular round bread. Oh, yeah. So we're talking about talents or tortillas. That's what this word is. That's what it means. The word kikar is also found in every other ancient Near Eastern language. In Akkadian, it's kakaru, and all the cognates are pretty much the same. Ugaritic, it's kakaru. In Egyptian, it's karkar, which also means to draw a circle in the sand with a stick. And so it always means circle. Never has anything to do with any particular location. Doesn't have any geographical reference at all. And I did that already. Outside the Old Testament, kikar has no application at all as a geographical standard. None. The 13 uses of kikar in the Old Testament refer to one thing, and it's the circular, the disc-shaped southern Jordan Valley north of the Dead Sea. That's what it refers to. And from all angles, especially up, or when you stand in the middle of it on the ground, you look around, it's like a green disc around you. And if you look at a satellite photograph, you can see it as well. It looks like a disc. It's a phenomenological, what we call a phenomenological secondary referent. Just like we say mesa. We get mesa, right? You get mesa. Why? Because it's flat and it looks like a table. Okay. Well, this thing is round and it looks like a kikar. Right? So it's the cities of the kikar. It's the plain of the Jordan, of the kikar of Hayarden, of the Jordan. Now this is important. Now this is the north end of the Dead Sea. You see that the Jordan River flows down and it widens out, the valley widens out to about triple its size right north of the Dead Sea. This is the alluvial plains because there are multiple rivers coming in too that are annual on the western side and coming in from the east side. They're perennial, but this forms a floodplain. And so there it is. That's the kikar of the Jordan. It's really clear. It's the disc. And already did that. Now the Hayarden, the Jordan. And by the way, I've never found anybody talking about this subject we're talking about who ever asked what the Jordan meant. By the way, it's never the Jordan River. It's not the Jordan River, it's Hayarden, which means the descent or the descending. That's what Jordan means. Of what? Fresh water. It's the freshwater catchment. Everything on the hills, all around there to the north, the snow melt in Lebanon and all that comes down into that Rift Valley, and it flows south, that fresh water, down the Rift Valley to the Dead Sea. And when Hayarden reaches the Dead Sea, which is the lowest spot on the face of the earth, now at 1,300 feet plus below sea level, do you suppose Hayarden, the descent, would terminate? Shouldn't any descending on the surface of this planet end when you reach the lowest spot on the planet? Yes, you can't go any further than that. And thus, Hayarden ends at the north end of the Dead Sea. This is critical. And if you don't understand this, then I tell my colleagues, you're just geographically challenged and you don't belong in this discussion at all. The kikar of the Jordan is north of the Dead Sea because Hayarden never refers to anything other than the Jordan River proper. And Hayarden never includes any part of the valley of Sodom, that part of the Rift Valley which is dead, but ends, quote, and this is a quote, and there, you can look through all these scriptures and it will give you this exact geography. The Jordan ends at the mouth of the Jordan at the Bay of the Dead Sea below Pisgah. So you have Hayarden in the north, the descending, living water. You have the Yam Hamalach, Sea of Salt, a basin of dead water. And that's what you've got. That's the Hebrew conception of it, and that's the way it works. So you have it all ended. Where's Pisgah? Ta-da! Pisgah's north of the Dead Sea. The Jordan only goes to the north end of the Dead Sea. So, I mean, that geographical discussion doesn't even need to continue. But the text says, remember we read through the text, it said it was well watered. How was it well watered? Like the Garden of Yahweh. How is Eden watered? Single river? Springs? Okay. Like Egypt, annual river inundations, depositing new layers of water-laden silt. The Nile does that. Jordan River does that. It's a Nile in miniature. Hydrologically, it's a Nile in miniature. Overflows its banks. In the spring of the year, water goes out several kilometers on each side of the Jordan River, covers that whole area, which is why the settlement patterns give you the floodplain, because they don't build closer than they're able, okay, because you're going to get flooded. Now, so that was, by the way, if Moses is writing or collating this text together, that would be a pertinent observation for a guy who grew up in Egypt, wouldn't it? Live and die by these things, don't you? All right, this is the best watered agri-scape in the region. The entire Transjordan aquifer disgorges right here. Those stars are springs. Why is Jericho there? Because there's a big spring there. Why are there no other cities and towns in the Bronze Age around Jericho? Because there's no more springs. We have so many springs. There's always water in the Kikar running across the road. And there's hundreds and hundreds of black pipes because they have illegal wells that are tapped into all of these springs around the area. And it's quite amazing. It's usually ignored, Ansareni says, that the term Arava applies to the Jordan Valley north of the Dead Sea. Too bad the author there didn't use the term Kikar. The map in the Atlas, Sacred Bridge, does need revision. Genesis 13 has to do with the high ground east of Bethel, and the reference to the Kikar fits better with the north end of the Dead Sea. That was part of our private discussion. We excerpted it from the Kikar dialogues. So, Lot viewed the entire Jordan district from the area. Remember, he lifted up his eyes, and he could see the entire valley. That's very important. And by the way, none of the southern Sodom advocates ever asked the question, where was Lot standing when he lifted up his eyes and saw the whole Kikar of the Jordan? They never asked the question. Well, if you ask the question, the answer is, he was standing at Bethel and Ai, and we're going to see where Bethel and Ai is. There it is. I excavated it. We excavated Ai for 6 years, and there's Bethel and Ai right there. You cannot see the Dead Sea from that location, except for the bare north end of it. On a good, clear day, you can just catch the north end of it if you're in the right spot. But you can see, especially if you're over near the scarp, you can see the entire valley. You can see the whole Kikar from there. That's where Lot was standing. He lifted up his eyes, looked over, and saw that the Kikar of the Jordan was well watered. And then he says he traveled eastward. Lot traveled eastward and pitched his tent as far as Sodom. Well, guess what? Back to that little map again. By the way, north is off to the left. So here we are at Bethel and Ai. Lot traveled that way. He traveled eastward. Text never says he went to the left or the right. He went forward. By the way, in Hebrew, there are no words, dedicated words for the cardinal directions. You face the rising sun. See how I knew that just instinctively? Setting. You face the rising sun. Forward or in front of is east. Backside or behind is west. Left hand is north. Right hand is south. Of course, you have to look contextually to see if it's even talking about directions. Maybe it's talking about I'm going forward, I'm going left, or I'm going right. But usually it has something to do with the directions. That's where Lot went. So Sodom can only be here, right there, somewhere there, east of Bethel and Ai. It cannot be anywhere in the Dead Sea Valley. It doesn't work. And by the way, every single city, town, and village in the south went belly up 500 to 800 years before the time of Abraham. Remember that chronological component looms large when you go looking for things that are connected to the biblical text. All right. Now, I'm not going to go over this. All I'm going to say here, and Kramelkov did some great work here, that the cities of the plain, all the cities of the Transjordan that are in the Mosaic text are written from south to north. The Transjordan cities are all listed from south to north. Why? Because that's a conventional Egyptian way to do it. And so the valley cities, considered Transjordan because they're on the east side of the river, they are all listed south to north. And I don't want to belabor that point too much. And I'm going to go into all of this detail that basically says Sodom and Gomorrah doublet are bigger than can't get my word there, Admah and Zeboim. And they're separate entities, and there's a longer distance between them than the doublet. And actually what we found on the ground, Sodom and Gomorrah are close together, longer distance, and then Admah and Zeboim are close together. 10-minute walk, hour and a half walk, 10-minute walk between the second set. It's amazing. Now, schematically, it stacks up like this. There's a short distance between Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom, Tal Hammam, Gomorrah, Tal Kafraim. There's a longer distance, and then you have a short distance between Admah, Tel Imrin, and Zeboim, Tel Blibel, and Tel Musta. Zeboim is plural. See it? The im ending is plural. It's a doublet. As a doublet, in fact, Nelson Glick, when he saw that, he said these two sites should be considered one site, not two. Blibel and Musta. They're so close together, they're just on opposite sides of a little river. And so there they are. Now, here are all the actual known ancient road beds coming into the area. And that's what we know about them. Sodom is there, and that's what it looks like today. Tal Hammam, Kafraim, Nimrin, Blibel, and Musta, and there's a whole lot of other sites in there. We have Ramah and Mois and Azema and Iktanu and Tahuna and Barakat. This is actually an ancient city-state. It's an ancient city-state, heavily populated, using 100% of their geography, 100% of the land around them. And I'm not even going to mention the Tal El Hammam megalithic field, which is the largest standing of dolmens, menhirs, standing stones, stone alignments, anywhere in the Near East. That's a whole other deal. Sodom was the biggest city on the eastern Jordan Disk. And so it's always listed first. It's only one ever mentioned by itself in the biblical text. And King Bera is the only one who has a voice. He's the chief of all these other kings. He has a voice. It's the largest Bronze Age city on the eastern Jordan Disk. And there it is. You can see it from Mount Nebo. It's a kilometer from one end to the other. And Abraham and Lot, let's put a date on them because even Albright agreed, and anybody who studies not the chronology of the text, which is using the ages of the patriarchs, which are honorific formulas and not based in numbers, but everybody knows that Abraham and Lot belongs to the Middle Bronze Age. Culturally and everything about the story belongs to the Middle Bronze Age. And so we had that little dry famine period. I don't have time to go into that. But Genesis 10 pushes the cities of the plain back well before the time of Abraham to the early epochs of what we call urbanization. And therefore, Genesis 10 goes back to the period of first urbanization, which is the early Bronze Age. And so if you're going to find Sodom, you better have this chronological configuration. We better have at least the EBA into the MBA. If we don't have the EBA into the MBA, then we don't have Sodom. It's an old city by the time it's destroyed. In fact, we now know Tal Hammam had been a city for at least 2,500 years with a major city wall around it for at least 2,500 years before it was destroyed around 1700 BC. It had been there a long, long time. Well, here she is. She's my baby. She's laid over with the early Bronze Age and the intermediate Bronze Age and the middle Bronze Age. It's all there, a little bit of Iron Age 2 on top, but there's a 700-year separation between those things And so we have the Chalcolithic period in the early bronze, and the intermediate bronze, and the middle bronze, and then a gap of at least 7 centuries, and then the Iron Age. What constitutes that gap? By the way, we have 21 strata. There they are. Don't have time to go into that. That's one of now over 100 radiocarbon dates that we have of our destruction, and you can see that it centers on around 1700 BC. I don't have time to go into all of this, because I want to get to some questions. It was fortified. Remember, Genesis 19 says Lot sat in the gateway of Sodom. Right? If you have a gateway, you have a fortification. And so here are the defenses. Those are the southern defenses, the early Bronze Age defenses added onto by the Middle Bronze Age folks. Those are the southern defenses. And there's the Middle Bronze Age being added onto the early Bronze Age. It's pretty stunning. It's not the first site to do that, because if you have existing fortifications and they happen to get knocked down by an earthquake and you have to rebuild, then sometimes you use what's left over from the old architecture in the new. But how big is this thing? It's very big. Those are the 3-meter thick walls on this tower alone, and you can see the entire length. By the way, the lower city has nothing over it. When you walk on the lower city, you're walking on the destruction of the Middle Bronze Age. You're walking on it. And so how far do we have to dig to get to the Middle Bronze destruction on the lower city? You're looking at it. You're walking on it right off the bat. We have this magnificent fortification system on those green lines are the preservation. Everything up to those, between those green lines is preserved on the lower city. It's really remarkable. And so look at that, about a 40% preservation factor. It's incredible. Dr. Lane Rittmeyer drawing the gateway of Sodom, my assistant Carol Cobes. It's pillared Minoan-style architecture in the gateway. What's interesting is that there's no other gateway like this. We are very much in the Aegean tradition of the Minoans. And here's Lane and I, and here's my stupid little reconstruction of it. And then here's Lane's reconstruction of it. And you can see, it's pretty incredible. That's a cutaway of it. You can see the light wells. We believe the way the pillars are configured that we have light wells in it. And this is all based on the archaeology, by the way. This is not speculative. This is just building up from the stone foundations that actually exist. Here's a reconstruction of a couple of MBA dwellings. There's a couple of intermediate Bronze Age dwellings before that. There's the first look at the MBA rampart we had. Here's my wife and I standing on top of the MB rampart. This is interesting. The rampart system, everywhere else in the Near East, Mesopotamia, rest of the Levant, all these ramparted fortification systems are made out of rammed earth. Rammed earth, packed earth. They're just big earthen berms, sometimes 5 to 10 meters at the top and 30 to 50 meters at the base. Sometimes supplemental, sometimes just going outward, sometimes freestanding with both inner and outer slopes. We're the only one, as far as we know. We've checked, and we very close friends with the leading expert of fortifications in the Near East, and he confirms this. Our fortification system, including the ramparts, are made of mud brick. The ramparts are laid bricks. How wealthy and organized was this city? It took, we estimate, based on how many mud bricks, based on the size of our mud bricks, how many mud bricks you can put into a cubic meter. And based on the estimated cubic meters of the fortifications of our site, it took somewhere between 40 and 60 million mud bricks to make those ramparts. That's a lot of labor, that's a lot of coordination, that's a lot of work. You have to dig the stuff, you have to put it together, you have to transport it, you have to lay it. And the lay pattern of the rampart is random. Of course it would be, right? It's not going to be brick laid like in the wall above it, sitting on top of it. It's random. Every layer is running in a completely different direction. Makes it extremely strong. Here's the little picture. By the way, that beautiful wall that you see going right across the top, we built that. We built that to keep the erosion from bringing the stuff above it down on us. And so we are working in multiple, you see, what you see here is the higher up is the Iron Age. Down where you see people lower down, that's all the Middle Bronze Age. And you see that very on the bottom and center of the picture, you see that deep probe. It went down 3 meters. We went down 3 meters underneath the palace and never hit anything but engineered fill. They built that Acropolis up on that inn artificially to get the palace up higher than the rest of the tell. It's funny, excavating about 50 meters to the northeast this season, my excavators there, after about 2 meters, hit bedrock. They hit bedrock. We didn't even come close to anything like that. And they went through the Middle Bronze 1 and the Intermediate Bronze Age and got back into EB3. I mean, they went through all the layers and occupations. We never even got close to that here. So they really, really went to great lengths to build up the palace. There's some of the palace walls. You see the one in the foreground where we actually preserved the mud bricks. We did some cutaways because we wanted to see the stones. But that wall is almost 3 meters thick. That's the exterior wall of the palace. It was a 4 to 5 story building. There's another look at it. It's big. Just big stuff all the way around. We had one of our Jordanian archaeologists who was sent by the DOA the last few years as one of our many representatives, and she came down to the site and she was awestruck. She says, I've been working in archaeology in Jordan for 25 years. I've never seen mud brick. And I picked up one that we'd taken off and said, here, take this home. You want a mud? Here's a mud brick, take it home as a souvenir. We have millions of them. It's one of the best preserved sites, but what's interesting about this, and I'm not sure if I have this, that's a story in and of itself. I probably have to tell that. In the palace area, all the mud bricks are 12 to 15, depending upon the foundations. But they're all this high. All the buildings are preserved up to this high. And they're sheared off. They're sheared off by some force. I mean sheared off, because around it, in excavations around the palace, we find no decomposed mud brick detritus. Didn't melt away, didn't just go away, didn't erode away. We would find it. We should find feet or meters of this stuff if this thing melted down and melted away. If it even fell down in an earthquake, it should be melting away. It's not melting away. It was literally sheared off. The airburst paper that came out in 2021, I wasn't on it, but in Nature Scientific Reports on the Tal el-Hammam, just look up, Google up the Tal el-Hammam airburst, Nature Scientific Reports. The guys who are studying that, this wasn't in the paper, by the way, but looking at the fractured quartz across the site, stressed fractured quartz, they're estimating now somewhere around 1 million PSI. That was the force, anyway, of this event. That's the other end of the palace. We had to dig through a Roman structure and 4 Iron Age layers to get down to this. My staff was angry at me. And by the way, that's as big as the trench was when we got to the bottom. We're 7 meters down, looking up at the sky like that without a hard hat. And my wife was angry. My staff was mad. And why are you down there? Because I know I'm going to hit it. I want the other end of the palace. I got to have the other end of the palace. I want to see those 40 by 40 centimeter mud bricks that are only used in the exterior of the palace wall. Guess what we hit? Right there. You're looking at it. We hit it. There it is. Brings chills back just thinking about collapse. Didn't collapse. And then there we found this. On the ring road. That little space is on the ring road between the palace and the fortification wall, Upper City fortification. And we found Bert and Ernie, of course. We had to call them Bert and Ernie. We don't know if it's Bert and Ernie or Bertha and Ernestina or whatever, but we have the fellow on the left of the screen is the skull is superheated and it's crushed. The orbits are actually crushed down, and he only has the upper dentition. The skull on the right, that's it. The second individual, that's all. Everything you see that's everything we know of him. By the way, they both had really good teeth. We had an orthodontist on the site, and he thought, man, I could use this as an example, of what the after looks like. And but there they are. And not only that, all through that whole, the destruction matrix is 1.5 meters deep. It's 1 meter to 1.5 meters deep. It's churned up with broken pottery, broken tools, broken bricks, smashed stuff, melted stuff, of course, and human bones. Just pieces of people blown up. We sent off, I was really interested to see if they had any Minoan DNA connections. Because we have lots of Minoan artistic and architectural motifs going on. And so we sent off some really good molars and to the Harvard Medical School DNA lab, and they worked on it for half a year. Got a letter back just a little while ago, a few weeks ago, a month ago. They said, and by the way, they just got the teeth. They got no story, they got nothing, just got the teeth. And she said, unfortunately, from our experience, the DNA, the material, the dentin, the DNA stuff in these teeth is so damaged by heat that we can't get the DNA out. And I was very disappointed. But there was a bright side to that. It showed that something went on here of a rather hot disposition. Well, there's the palace, and I'm going to end this thing right here. With the tiles, by the way, we have a special kind of pottery in the palace, and it's beautiful. We call it multi-slipped cross-wiped palace ware. Look at those colors. It's amazing, isn't it? It's the only place in the entire Near East, in any period, that you get this type of surface treatment on pottery. It only comes from the Sodom Palace. Only the Sodom Palace has this. And we have a doctoral student writing her dissertation on it right now. It's amazing stuff. But anyway, how do we find Sodom? You look at the biblical text, and you go to the right place. And you have to have the right time, right stuff. Right place, right time, right stuff. Ptolemy has it all. There is no even imaginable criteria for Sodom that is not fulfilled by Ptolemy. Now, if Ptolemy had nothing to do with the Bible, had no suggested connection to the Bible, everyone would just be happy. Everyone would just be happy. But since we made the connection, which was really obvious, and I told the guys on the paper, I said, you guys don't live in my world. The astrophysicists and the people that wrote the paper, after 6 or 7 years of investigating, taking samples, doing electron microscope work and all that stuff, they published their stuff. They're looking for an airburst. I mean, the phenomenology of Genesis 19 says what? Fire and burning stone. Actually, it's burning stone. Goprit va'esh. Fire, burning stone and fire, not sulfur. By the way, this sulfur idea is nonsense. Sulfur is within the semantic domain of that word goprit. But in the scriptures, even it's translated lightning several times. It's a yellow hot phenomenon, whatever it is. But basically, you go chase it back to the early Akkadian and even over into Arabic, it means burning stone. That's why the Quran says, the Quran of the event says, God threw burning stone. Well, that's the same word, same concept. So, burning stone and fire from Yahweh out of the heavens. What does that sound like to you? Does that sound like an earthquake? Does it sound like some geological event where some like underground gas belched up and caught it on fire, and somehow the plume of flame landed back on the cities and they burned. You know, people have actually suggested that for Baba Draw in the southern cities. It's like, any geologists here? Go look it up. That has never geologically happened in the history of the planet. Yet they tried to get around the text of it being a cosmic event by doing that. No, it's a cosmic event, pure and simple. And I would say this, if you go to Sodom and you don't find evidence of a cosmic destruction, then the Bible is wrong. I'd be so bold, looking at that language in the text, I'd be so bold as to say, just as if we'd have gone looking for Sodom and the cities of the plain in the area where we did, where the Bible said they were, and we didn't find anything, I would say, the Bible's wrong. Text is wrong.
What did you find?
We found Tal Hammam, 7 cities, and an airburst destruction. An airburst, a meteoritic airburst destruction of Tunguska class. Why Tunguska? Because Tunguska 1908, a meteoritic airburst happened over the Siberian forest and totally burned, decimated, knocked down about 2,500 square kilometers of Siberian forest in a blink of an eye. One of those, about 35,000 years ago, happened over the western Egyptian desert and glazed the entire sand of that area. And by the way, some of King Tut's jewelry, especially that big scarab that was on the mummy, that great big flying winged scarab, that big thing, it's not jade, it's not green jade, it's green melt glass from that impact. It's impact glass. And I brought some tonight. So we're going to open this up to questions. We stay, you want to stay to midnight? I'm fine. I do not run out of energy. I just keep going. But I brought stuff. And some of the stuff is not published, so please don't take any pictures of it. Some of it is, some of it isn't. But some of you who are skeptical about some of this, come to my lab in Albuquerque. I welcome you down there. You come down and look at our stuff. Look at all this stuff. It's amazing. You'll be convinced. There was an airburst that happened over this area that snuffed out the longest lasting city-state in the southern Levant. It snuffed it out in the blink of an eye. Blew it right off the map. Well, it didn't blow the foundations away, and some of them are bricks, but it blew it away. It ended the most concentrated, successful civilization center in the southern Levant in the blink of an eye. By the way, how many cities were destroyed around it? If you get off the Kikar, how many cities went down around it? None. They all went happily from the Middle Bronze into the Late Bronze Age. If you go up all those roads leading out from Tal Hammam and go to any of the cities up on the hills around, or even up the Jordan Valley, 25 kilometers away up the Jordan Valley, dear Allah, marched right into the Late Bronze Age, no problem. Civilization was snuffed out on a very specific 400 square kilometer piece of real estate that had been there. By the way, to make this even more dramatic, did you realize that every single southern Levantine city on both sides of the river went belly up in 2500 BC at the end of the early Bronze period? Did you know that? Did you know Jerusalem itself was not even occupied from 2500 BC down to about 1800 BC? Or Hebron. In fact, not a single town mentioned in the Abraham narratives was occupied between 2500 BC and 1800 BC. When are you going to place Abraham? After 1800 BC. You got to have if you go before 1800 BC, you don't have Jerusalem, you don't have Hebron, you don't have Shechem, you don't have Dan, you don't have Damascus. Sorry, it's just the archaeology, I'm sorry. It's the way it is. And so these people say, oh, Abraham belongs to the 22nd century BC. That's what the Bible says. 4,000 BC creation and 2500 BC flood and 2166 BC Abraham. That's a terrible injustice to the text. It's not what the text says. But no, you got to go with the historical synchronisms. You got to put it in the right place at the right time. And this destruction was big, bad, ugly, instant. And guess what? This is the best watered agricultural landscape in the region. I'm going to prove it to you right now. Remember I just said, what did I say? How many cities in the southern Levant went belly up at the end of the early Bronze Age? All of them. All of them, except one. Talamam continued without a blink of an eye. All of its towns and villages. In fact, we actually found that some of our towns and villages started after 2500 during the intermediate Bronze Age, in the time when nobody else was operational. Talamam arguably had a bump up in its civilization during the time when everybody else went offline. Why? I'll tell you why. Water. The climate went south. You can see it on the climate charts. The climate, the Dead Sea level, right before that period, going out of the EB3 into the IB1, dropped over 150 meters in about as many years. Climate changed dramatically. Got wet after that, went back up, and then civilization developed back. But right about the time of Talamam, we have another little glitch in the hydrology. But Talamam came perfectly through that climate disaster. Didn't even blink an eye. So, let me put it this way simply. When everybody else in the southern Levant went belly up, Talamam continued to thrive. When nobody else in the southern Levant went belly up, Talamam and all of its cities were destroyed. And guess what? This is the best watered agricultural land in the region, and nobody built on that piece of real estate for the next 700 years. Why? Because we engaged some soil scientists to tell us how fast land recuperates in that arid part of the world, and they said about 700 years before they could farm again, given normal cycles. So it also fits the soil science. So you had a question. And we have actually have a microphone somewhere. There it is. All right. You have been designated.
I am the roving mic.
Yes.
So who has the question, Barry? I've got a